As a deathshead commander of the Shilvanti Imperium, Solani Tonis had faced plenty of grueling situations. Her first rotation had been in the Galorndon cluster, on a little planet that had been a few light years too close to a stellar event. Thousands of years later, the atmosphere was still ravaged, the landscape blasted into a barren desert, and the ecology had recovered just enough to think algae might be a good idea. Despite the breathable atmosphere, the planet's ozone layer was virtually non-existent. You stayed in your suits, buttoned up in the shelters, or you fried. The planet had a stunning night sky, and if it had been anywhere near the core world, someone would have snapped it up for eco-forming. Out in the back of Beyond, it was a world of brutal deserts, tiny poisonous seas that smelled like dead fish, and an ideal place for training while the survey mission rotated through the next dozen systems. Goddess knew the planet had to be one of the most goddess-forsaken spots in the galaxy. It had also been an ideal world for smugglers. That was just the life as a deathshead. You went where the service sent you, doing the jobs that Marines couldn't. It wasn't just the gear and the training, though that was the best of the best. It was the lifestyle. It meant living like a ghost. You didn't occupy territory, you moved in, eliminated the problem, and disappeared. It was part of the mystique. You built the reputation, and the reputation worked for you. It didn't carry the load, but a target that thought she was facing a death's head was already halfway in the grave. The smugglers had been setting up a new staging area, and must have seen their shuttle come down. Lacking a ship of their own and with no way to hide, the women had opted for a desperate ambush. They were Silver Suns. Prison wasn't an option for women like them, and they knew it. Using the element of surprise, they'd actually managed to take out 2 girls from her unit. Along the way, they'd also shredded the shelters meant to hold off the deadly levels of radiation, right along with the water reclamation gear. That was bad luck, but when they were going down, the vengeful bitches trashed their own gear on purpose. The surviving supplies and what they managed to scavenge lasted into the second week. Without the shelters and trapped in their suits, the pall of claustrophobia began to set in. It was 4 days later when the first of the girls gave in to madness, driven by thirst and the confines of being trapped in their suits. As insanity and thirst drove them past the edge, the killing started. Terror was supposed to be knowing a death's head was coming for you. Real terror was knowing a crazed deathhead wanted to kill you and drink your blood. When the shuttle finally landed for extraction, a third of the unit was still alive, and Solani had earned her battlefield commission in ways no one would ever argue with. There had been so many tours since, good and bad. The life wasn't all blood and mud, though there had been more than enough of that. It was also the loneliness. Like the missions, it meant a transitionary existence lacking any real ties outside your pod. Even if a girl was lucky enough to find someone, how did you share the life? Guys just didn't have the common ground to understand an existence built around pain and pride, buoyed up by knowing you were the tip of the Imperial sword. The nights alone sucked. She'd earned her bragging rights in tour after tour, but as the years went past, the post-mission ritual of going out to a bar with the girls to tie one on had come to feel like a dead end filled with emptiness. Marines and Navy gals got married if they were lucky. Devs heads just faded away. As it was, there weren't many cushy tours like this one, spent watching a princess. Though it had also turned into watching a guy day and night, alright, a human guy, one who clearly knew loneliness and who might even understand what her life was like. It had started as an idle thought, but after meeting him on the cliffs, what girl wouldn't have fantasies? A woman would have to have a heart of stone. Naturally, she was a little desperate. She wasn't getting any younger, and retirement would only be a few years off. When she heard the scream, of course she went running. The turn into the hotel's art gallery hadn't been graceful. Something that looked delicate and expensive had gotten in the way, but in fairness, the riot had shattered 2 displays already, and she gained precious ground. Diving across the table kept her from stepping on anything sharp. The The blue smears of blood on the floor and the howls of pain were proof of that, but she managed to cut across the room, past several of the women. Knocking over the pillar probably wasn't as bad as she thought, though, honestly, that hadn't looked structural. She trailed Warwick through the clothing shop, where a trio of women were having it out in the wreckage. Two had grabbed part of a clothing rack and were beating each other senseless, while a third lay underfoot, too busy vomiting to do any damage. The mob around them was alternately cheering and fighting each other, while the clerks in hotel livery stood by, shrieking. She spotted Warwick moments later as he tried to slip out the back, hidden under a parka. As the screams of the mob rose again, she swept him up over her shoulder, bolted for the exit, and never looked back. Fortunately, she'd known where his suite was, and after ditching the last of the angry mob in a charge with the florist's shop, she'd made her way there. Warwick had calmed down after they'd gone inside. He'd given her a look. That was when she knew he recognized her. Without a word, he'd taken hold of Shalea, dragged her into the bedroom, muttering about his honeymoon, and slammed the door. She stood there in silence, her dreams crashing around her as Professor Pelavon studied her intently. Until now, she thought the desert had been the most wretched experience of her life. "So, dear, it seems you're acquainted with my husband." Mivere Pelavon canted her head, arched one eyebrow, and pointed to the chair. "I'd like you to sit down and tell me what just happened." It didn't feel like being asked for her consent. It was more like being given the option. Solani sat down. "Get out of the bunker," they said. "Just an easy surveillance job." Sergeant Jelk huffed as she looked around her room. Rather than a guest accommodation, the hotel manager only managed to squeeze them into one of the staff rooms. Squeezed was the operative word. Two wardrobes sat on either side of the sink. Aside from that, the room was just large enough to barely contain a set of bunk beds. As a deathshead commando, the goddesses knew she'd put her head down to sleep in worse places, but it would still be easy to mistake the place for a closet. Considering the fiasco, it was probably just as well she kept hold of the key, or they wouldn't have this. It could be worse. A chime sounded from her omnipad, and she held back a curse. It was almost 6. Time to call in and report. Wherever the captain had run off to with Warwick, it had better be good. It had all happened, just as Jama said it would. For some reason, the conversation had stuck with her. It had been pre-term week, 2 or 3 years ago, when Mivere had found herself slipping away to get a drink, and some distance from the crowd of parents. Jama materialized at her elbow. Glancing at her from the corner of his eye, he gave her a mischievous wink. "You think it's bad now, lass? Just give it a couple of years, and all this will look like a stroll along the seaside." She'd had almost a decade at the school by that point, but Jama was a creature of the deep. He had forgotten more about the academy than most people ever learned, and it was a singular comment. Of course, she'd asked what was on his mind. "I've seen it before. No mistake. That wee princess says no one hears much about. Unless they announce she's going into the Navy or the Marines, you can bet the lass will be coming here. Next thing you can, there'll be all sorts of tomfoolery going on, and interior agents looking under every bush." Jama had taken a swig of his drink. It was clearly not his first, but his accent wasn't quite out of control. She'd seen him chase parents off with it. "You mark my words." In hindsight, she had. She always spoke regularly with Ganya, who began grooming her years ago to take over someday. When this year had begun, the conversation with Jama had been long out of mind. There was simply too much going on. Her sabbatical to Earth had become so much more than she could have dreamed. Then there was bringing Tom home with her, securing his position on the faculty, getting him started on the exhibit, preterm, classes, and every step of the way finding out if all her hopes would come true. They had, and so much more than she would have believed possible. It was the trip to the hospital that had brought the conversation back to mind. Sitting there in the autocab that awful evening, she thanked the goddess for the medical evacuation, and the suspicion grew that, perhaps, it had not been so miraculous after all. If she'd had any lingering doubts, the quiet conversation shared with Leia had settled things. Leia's former student was the co-wife of Princess Indara, and while the matter had gained public attention, that was well after the fact. As grateful as she'd been, emergency medical transport did not suddenly come down from on high like the grace of Shill, nor did members of the imperial family materialize to visit hospital patients if it wasn't a matter of public concern. Since the news hadn't broken, the public was unaware, and even after the news hit, there had been no mention of any visit by Prince Adam. And so, there was all of that to consider, which she did at some length. Tom survived. The three of them were married, and if there was a princess in the school, so be it. Not that she could tell Jama. Empress loved the man, but his ego was large enough already. The woman sitting in front of her was not with the interior. Mevere adored her niece, and she understood the work the interior did. The woman seated on the other side of the table wasn't the type. While Solani was tall, pretty, with the hair in a military cut, and looked like she could bench press a Taurox, she'd also withered under Miv's gaze and done as she was told. She seemed formidable, but she wasn't the type that presumed. On the whole, she reminded Mevere of an adult version of Sephir. Intelligent and capable. Confident, but used to deferring to authority in the right situations. Not the interior, then, which made her something else. During their conversation, she'd done her best to put the woman at ease. It wasn't easy, as Solani looked like she was stewing in agony. Be fair. The headboard thumping against the wall might be partially to blame. Tom had come in, being set down by Solani. After brushing himself off, he muttered something about "not again," and carted Leia off to the bedroom with a determined look on his face. Leia's squeak of surprise had turned into other noises soon after. The Imperial Ocean Reserve was a delight in every way, but while it had been modernized over the centuries to maintain its glory, that had not included soundproofing. Leia had been insisting they consider a third wife, and while that seemed premature before, it no longer seemed quite so fanciful. Solani was a few years younger than Leia, and seemed quite charming in the moments when she didn't look ready to die of embarrassment. She stuttered and turned cerulean when asked if she was involved with anyone, and actually flinched when Miv asked if she liked her husband. So there was that. What was the old saying? Those who give up a little security in the face of a little anarchy will soon have all of the latter and none of the former. Goddess lovers, we did marry a human, and clearly Leia is right. Something needs to be done. Reading between the lines as best as she was able, it was quite likely that Solani had saved Tom from disaster today. If she'd had a hand in the medical evacuation, that certainly made twice, and given the way she was suspiciously fidgeting around some questions, it seemed entirely possible there was something more. Well, life was demanding enough without wisdom and understanding, and only a fool turned down a gift when the goddess dropped one in your lap. This is practically room service. I don't want you to fret. If I understand you correctly, you've just saved my husband from being carried off by an angry mob. Miv spoke louder, trying to keep Solani's attention. This really couldn't go on much longer, or she'd start to giggle. Don't mind the noise, dear. I know my husband and wife. Now, I expect I'll be needed in the other room in another 20... A long shuddering moan from... A long shuddering moan from Leia arose from the other room. In another 10 minutes, I imagine you'll want to go get cleaned up. Miv rose from her seat, giving Solani the smile Garnia referred to as twisting their arm but making them like it number one. Now, I insist that you join us for a late breakfast tomorrow. I expect my co-wife shall want to sleep in a bit, but that will give me a chance to talk with her first. The agonized look on Solani's face really was precious, but to her credit, she rose on cue, obediently following me there to the door. That had true worth. Knowing when to leave was always the height of good manners. I'll expect you here at 10. It was early evening. Getting cold, but the sun was out, which made for the best kind of evening on Shill. Reminiscent of a crisp fall day in Maryland, and Tom Steinberg sat in his deck chair, smoking a spikeweed joint, as he watched the pups play in the background. The Pezrin had introduced him to the narcotic back on Earth. Supposedly, when drunk as tea, the leaf dulled their sense of smell. When smoked, however, it was a mild hallucinogen, like Tom had smoked too much pot. Exactly like too much pot. Tom saw streaks of colour pop in and out, like imperfections on film. If he smoked some more, which he fully intended to do, things would leave trails when they moved. Overhead, the clouds pulsated and spiraled. It was a nice way to unwind. Not to worry. Spikeweed highs were short, and if need be, Shanky could watch the kids for 15 minutes. Speaking of, the Rhynal waddled onto the back porch. The weather was perfect this time of year. Never above 50. Tom liked the cold. Nevertheless, he held onto Shanky like a teddy bear. "Ugh," the Rhynal suggested, indignantly as it fidgeted. "Sorry, bro." Tom put Shanky back down. The little green basketball waddled off and joined the kids. "Don't wander too far," Tom called after them. Not that they could wander very far. The backyard was fenced in. It just felt like the right thing to say. Through the haze of spikeweed, Tom could hear his omnipad blooping. He put on his best sober face and turned on the camera. "Go for Tom." He swallowed. There was the boss. "Hey, man." Prince Adam, just Adam to Tom. He refused to do the prince stuff. Appearing on the other end of the line. "Tom," Adam said, "I got a job for you. One you're gonna love." "Oh yeah?" Tom leaned forward, all traces of his spikeweed high ignored. "Do tell." "Hey, Dex, no curb stomping your sister. I don't want to have to explain to Mum why Aerie suddenly has brain damage." Adam chuckled. "Having fun?" "Oh, a blast. Let me tell you, the woman running that place right now, Qadira Sariva, the staff won't say much because they're scared. Interior, so duh, but I think she's batshit crazy." Tom got up and strode over to the fridge. It wasn't exactly easy, or cheap, getting beer all the way out here, and he was still waiting on the microbrew kit he'd ordered to arrive. In the meantime, Tom was not going to drink those blue grails. The things were vile. Absolute piss. Some things were just worth the cash. "So, what's the job?" "You're going to upload a virus to the Northern Palace's mainframe." Tom almost dropped the pad. "Hot damn! You weren't kidding." "Told you you'd like it." Miv slipped off her camisole and cast it aside to stand naked beside the bed. Looking down, she surveyed the tangle of her husband and co-wife with a smile, before climbing under the sheets beside him. On the other side of the bed, Leia was already snoring, but Tom looked over at her with that weary half smile he often wore, and her heart filled with delight. They were a family now. Stroking his arm, she leaned in to kiss his cheek. Her hand moved down, caressing his shaft. "Hey, can we talk for a moment?" "Not about... my trip out... Tom shifted, but he definitely started to focus as his body responded. His voice was still thick, but it took on the blur of pleasure rather than sleep, as she stroked his shaft a bit faster and teased along him with her tongue. "Mm-hmm. What's up?" "You are," Miv grinned, "and we'll talk about your excursion later." She could wait her turn for Leia, now and then. And this had to come first. Her voice was little more than a whisper as she worked her way down his body. "I just wanted to tell you, I've invited someone to breakfast." Oh, fuck me. Tom's voice grew strained and he shifted his hips, bucking against her hand. "Oh, I'm going to," she grinned, teasing him lower. "I just wanted to tell you before I forgot." "Breakfast? Sure." His voice took on a rough burr that revealed his need. It was so different hearing that from a man, but she'd come to love it, and she wasn't surprised when he moved, rolling on top of her. Well, he'd agreed now. It was for his own good, and the first wife always. Oh, Tom. She felt him working inside her, and thought became something for later. Aku was excited, but maintained his poise. This would be special, and he ignored the glances of the other 11 initiates as he took the stage. Mistress Trangia was there, evaluating his every movement. He drew in a breath, slowly, before letting it settle. A cliff singer should never appear rushed. The first few notes from the steel Arecha echoed over the studio. Then the second refrain rang out, and he began. "What are you waiting for? Pick up your pad, yes. Write me down for today. In your agenda. Come out from your safe zone. Walk to your door. There might be a good thing or two waiting for you. We're in the dark, and the only guide is the whispering sound of Stop! Trangia's voice shot out over the speaker like a gunshot. It was followed by a very audible sigh before she continued, contemptuously dismissing him from her attention. "Initiates, let's begin. We shall discuss everything Initiate Akurun has failed to comprehend, as it's obviously going to take some time." Aku's heart fell into his stomach, but he remained standing at attention, in the classic pose. If only she'd hear his presentation. "Mistress, I did not invite you to speak," Trangia said frostily. The air did not grow cold. It didn't need to. She was a mistress of the art, and the tension in the room reflected the skill of her voice. "I expected better of you after taking you on tour. Working with you so you might measure up. I'd hoped you were learning to appreciate what is required of you now, but clearly I was mistaken. Otherwise you wouldn't present me with this antiquity. You have been holding my enclave back and wasting my time." Aku felt like he was suffocating. He'd heard the words from the other initiates, but the competition had been growing ever more fierce for Trangia's name. Counting each other down was expected, but to hear it from her? He didn't deserve to be treated like this. No initiate did. But Trangia had become ever more exacting now that she was close to retiring. He wanted to run from the studio and never return, but he remained in position, head held high. Seated around Trangia, the other initiates didn't shift uncomfortably. They each held their pose as well. It didn't matter. He could feel their eyes on him, and knew they were all thinking the same thing. That he was no longer in the running. That he was a failure. At that moment, Aku felt like crying out, to find his own strength and voice. He knew he was more than adequate, that he had so much more to offer, if only he could prove it. "I want to break free." Belder caught Liam looking at her now and then during the tram ride, and even more when they boarded the elevator to the 120th floor. He didn't say a word about where they were going, and the talk stayed light, but his smile grew infectious. As his grip on her hand grew tighter, her heart fluttered. Everything had gone perfectly. A few songs later, and she was smiling shyly at him as they walked hand in hand off the dance floor. Orinka Plaza hadn't lost its vibrant energy, and as the sight of their first date, she hoped it would conjure the magic she was looking for. Liam seemed to be having the best time, but this was the ultimate date. And as they settled down at the table, it was time to ask the big question. They both knew what tonight was. It didn't seem possible that Liam would say no, or he simply wouldn't have come. Well, that would have been crushing. It hadn't happened. He was here. They were together, and the casual conversation and easy smiles they shared made it all feel right. She still felt so nervous she might get sick, but while her stomach had been doing backflips since they walked off the floor, she was too happy inside for that to happen. Maybe the most aggravating part was that she'd had a whole speech ready. As they sat down together, she couldn't remember a single word. Liam looked perfect, and there didn't seem to be any question of what was coming. He had that easy smile about him, and together they'd ignored the cheers and catcalls from the rest of the party crowd. Tonight was their evening. If only she could think of how to ask. You know, I've been thinking a lot about tonight, and, well... Belda shook her head and started over. Have you thought about where you want to live? I mean, I just realized we never talked about it. I'm good where you are, Liam shrugged. The smile didn't leave his face, and he reached out to take her hand. I've been here on Shill, and it's been good. Being with Hope has kind of started my life over. It's not like I had a whole lot going on back on Earth. Friends, sure, but no real family. Sure, Hope's my big sister, but she's the only family I'm close to. And Willist is close to Shill, right? It is. I mean, it's light years, but it's only a few days by ship, and couriers are going back and forth all the time, so it's easy to send messages any time you want. Belda felt a surge of hope blossoming inside her. Liam had kicked a bit over the idea of a wedding on Willist, though that had mostly been over the how. I have all my family there, though I know it's not what you're used to. It's, well, it's not built up like this. Belda kicked herself, even as she waved a hand at all the flashing lights. The glitz and the glamour of the pavilion showed off the whole skyline of the capital, with all the Imperium had on display. You could spend a lifetime in the megacity and not see a fraction of what it had to offer. Willist was small, important, but not like this. If she wasn't honest about that, what if he was unhappy? Sooner or later that might make him want to leave there. And her. Trust me, Belle, I never thought it would be. I mean, Earth is always going to be home in a lot of ways, but it's not like my part of Canada was all that fancy. It's great, but I didn't grow up with all this. It's a lot of fun, but it's nothing I need. Liam gave her hand another squeeze. So, tell me about Willist. Belda licked her lips. She'd babbled on about home with Liam a couple of times, but had she said anything important? She kicked herself again. This was not a proposal. Still, it was important. Willist has 3 cities. There are towns here and there, but only 3 real cities. Would he miss this kind of life? Probably. He loved to dance, and this wasn't selling it. I guess the best thing about it is how free you feel there. There are only 30 million people on the whole planet. Sometimes when you're out in the ranges, it feels like you're the only person in the whole world. I suppose that sounds pretty lonely. I wouldn't be alone if we were there together. Liam nodded. Look, Belle, I know what tonight is all about, and back home, I'd be the one sweating over how to ask you what's on our minds. He arched an eyebrow. How about I make this easy? I'll take that for a yes. Liam slid out of his chair onto one knee, as she glanced down at the floor beneath him in confusion. Of all the times he could drop something. Belda, will you? Hey there, sweetie. Liam looked up and Belda turned. 3 Dixie girls were standing just behind her, and the one in the center leaned in, taking Liam by the arm to help him up. Did you lose something? I bet I've got what you need. No, that's not... I'm fine. Liam struggled to his feet as the Dixie girl grinned. No one could smile like an Dixie, but Belda froze in cold fury. Dressed in all black, the Dixie girl wore tight leather pants that ended low on her hips. Her top was a sleeveless vest, zipped only halfway and showing off her breasts, while black and white arm wraps accentuated the look. The only concession to colour was the vibrant streaks of electric red she'd woven into the tips of her long hair, and the matching ear combs that were popular right now. She was dressed for a night on the town, and she barked out a laugh, arching her chest in Liam's face. "Mind if I dance with your date?" It wasn't a question. Liam was barely on his feet before the Adixie was tugging him off toward the dance floor, followed by her friends. "This is not happening." Everything about the girl screamed the big city life, from the way they dressed to the way they walked. She stood up as they hemmed Liam in, all her fears rolled up in one big package. She didn't need to imagine the big city carrying Liam off. It was doing it right now in front of her eyes. Beelda took a few quick steps and pulled the Adixie around by her shoulder, a second before her fist connected square on the girl's nose. "Yes, I fucking mind!" If you were employed at the Imperial Ocean Reserve, the rooms were adequate for sleeping, but the opulence stayed outside. Jelk sat on the lower part of the bunk bed, listening to it squeak whenever she turned this way or that. There wasn't even a view. Amenities such as looking outside weren't wasted on the staff, and she shook her head, grimacing. Might as well be in space. It was boredom, pure and simple. At least back at the base or on a starship, she could hit the gym or go down to the lounge. Now she was stuck here reporting in while Goddess only knew what the captain was up to. Dinner had been good, but the manager had been so angry at her presence that she'd never gotten the clerks on the number. Jelk let out a restless sigh, frustrated with it all. There had to be something more productive or engaging to do. This felt worse than the bunker. Monotony sucked. Still, it was something you learned to put up with as a soldier. She took a deep breath and put herself in the moment. Closing her eyes, she focused on her breathing. No one was shooting. Things could be worse. No one was shouting. Well, not at the moment. That was fine. No interior agent monitoring them. Well, not until Davari went over the reports. She stretched out, enjoying the feeling of doing nothing. Maybe a nice walk, later on, once the hotel was quiet. The goddess only knew what the captain was going through. Probably hiding out and laying low. The constables hadn't taken her away with the others. That was the sensible move. Keep it quiet, let things blow over, stay off the radar. The door slammed open and Solani burst in, grinning like mad. "I have a date!" "You have got to be fucking kidding me," Jelk said, slowly. "Ma'am." Back in his room, Aku crumpled onto his bed. It was all over. Even if he didn't want to admit it in his heart, he knew Trangia would never have spoken to him that way if she'd held any doubts. Calling him a waste, saying he was holding her enclave back, before the others. He looked about his room, bleakly, still refusing to believe it. Trangia had grown ever colder, cruel, testing all of them. Maybe this was just one more. He knew he was good enough. No. Even though he was a boy, he knew that he was better than the others. Maybe it was just the strain of the tour finally taking its toll. He'd been pouring all his energy into perfecting his performance, tested before audiences for weeks. The strain under Trangia's reviews had been nearly unbearable. Tears began to stream down his face as he thought about how much this life meant to him. There was always the music. It was in the core of his very soul. He only needed a way to prove it, to make Trangia hear him, not as an initiate, but as a performer, as her equal. The thought of washing out from the enclave swept over him again. A bleak future of being unable to perform on stage, held in check forever by the guild's law. In that awful moment, his future as a captive yawned before him like a chasm into the deeps, and his tears began to flow. His omnipad pinged. This was probably it. Trangia's official release. His doom. How long had she waited to compose it? Had it been done before he even stepped into the studio this evening? He reached for it with a shudder, swiping open the app to read his fate. The Mistress of the Court has received their Imperial Majesty's command, and has the honor to invite Akarun Dorskulo to give a command performance at the Northern Palace, acknowledging this year's Imperial Science Award in the presence of HIRH Princess Indara Tasu, and HIRH, Princess Qadira Tasu. Still trying to get out of the Adix's grip, Liam barely had time to see the punch connect. It wasn't fast, but it came in hard, and he was pretty sure he heard bone crunch an instant before the girl howled in pain. Belder didn't stop there, wheeling back and grabbing the tray their drinks came on, and slamming it hard into the girl's throat. The Adixie went down, gagging, and Belle followed through, kicking hard on her leg, stomping down on the knee. He had a moment's freedom before the other Adixie hauled him back. Her friend started towards Belder from the side, drawing back a huge fist. Belder pivoted around, her arm blocking the punch even as her fist connected with the side of the girl's head, snapping her back. The girl looked stunned, but rather than wait, Belle kicked up between the girl's legs, connecting right in the... God damn, that had to hurt. The girl arched up on her toes a split second before crumpling to the ground and curling into a ball. Liam felt the girl beside him let go, and he glanced down as light flashed, as her hand came out of one pocket. Fuck that! Adixie girls always looked fast when he'd seen them on the dance floor, and while Belder had taken down two by strength and surprise, and damn, Belle fights dirty, he didn't like the look of those brass knuckles. They weren't that, quite, with a bottom ridge that poked out more like a wild cat. Whatever it was, he didn't want it connecting with his girl. No longer getting tossed around by three women built like linebackers, Liam planted his foot and spun. The kick connected hard in the girl's abdomen, and he waited in satisfaction for her to go down hard beside her too. The Adixie staggered, then refocused on him and slowly smiled, revealing rows of white teeth inches from his face. Oh, I'm going to enjoy you, pretty boy. Great. Different fucking anatomy. She didn't see it coming as Belder's fist sailed over his shoulder and connected, hard. The girl went down like a felled ox and lay beside her friends. The crowd drew back around them, but no one moved to help the fallen Adixie. Alright, boys and girls, now it's a party! The noise went from loud to deafening as the DJ cranked up the volume, and he could see a burly group of girls bearing down with "bouncer" written all over them. Did you see that first punch? Belder raised her voice as she stepped closer, looking around as if daring anyone else to come her way. Looking down at the trio of huddled girls, she suddenly shrugged and grinned. I bet I broke her nose. Oh yeah, that was a beauty of a hit. There was no denying it, but there was no telling how soon those three would be back on their feet, and Liam tugged her a few steps back. Hey, when'd you learn to fight like that? I grew up defending my younger brother and two cousins. Belder was breathing hard as she stepped in beside him and raised a fist, daring anyone to come closer. So, do you want to get married? Well, yeah, Liam yelled, as the nearest Rakiri drew close and reached out. This was probably going to cost him. Qadira Zariva watched the light on her omnipad fade for a moment, after closing out the call with Arisa Mwifal. As her lieutenant, Mwifal was dependable and occasionally cunning. Stolid. Relying on her was a delicate balance of qualities that always needed careful consideration. Anyone who believed there was a science to controlling people was fooling themselves. It was actually an art form. Arisa Mwifal had all of the talents and aptitudes necessary to be useful, even occasionally inspired in her work. She'd tend to her orders, allowing Qadira to get on with matters of greater scope. Such as this celebration. Qadira went back to her task and fed the last of her photographs into the shredder, watching as it rendered the image of Lady Selike into little more than powder. Had she unconsciously saved Selike's picture for last? There was a certain symmetry, given how she had removed Selike from the burden of life. It seemed even the tedious chore of emptying her beloved photo gallery could imitate art. Finished, she tied up the bag of clippings for disposal. Her beloved picture gallery, her one indulgence regarding the noble she killed, was no more. Such is life, she murmured, setting it aside. It was less than rubbish now, but it lived on in her memory. The notion of this gala was unorthodox, but there it was. This year's Imperial Science Award, awarded to the humans who were, even now, sequestered away on the grounds of Empress Zarika's Academy for Young Ladies. While the Northern Palace was renowned for its gardens in summer, no one came in winter. Hosting the award here was not happenstance, but it was an arrangement she was in no position to refuse. When faced with a crisis, one should never be afraid to improvise. It wasn't known to be one of Agent Devari's strengths, but perhaps she was growing as a person. Qadira stood before the briefcase, studying it with care. Row upon row of neatly arranged frames, each of them was the reminder of a demise, and a celebration of her will. As she sat Selakae's frame back in its pride of place, she reached and opened the palace of her memories, and each frame became transformed. No longer mere containers, they grew and flowed into rooms and grounds, each the scene of her retribution. She looked upon each of the little rows, and as she did so, her mind walked through them. Tidying the frame slightly into its proper position, she could see herself standing there. Selakae lay beside the end table she'd knocked over, kicking feebly before surrendering to death. Eventually the woman grew still, just beneath the elaborate painting in her bedroom. Even though she'd been surreptitious about its execution, the night had lacked a certain elegance. Selakae had been one of her early works. 2 frames over was Baroness Duprain, who'd so loved that cafe near her estate, and unfortunately choked on her meal. Her death had been fitting testimony to a life of gluttonous excess and indulgence, producing nothing. Her talents squandered, she'd had a habit of luring investors into schemes that never panned out, bilking foreigners and the elderly, before the company vanished and she created another. 2 rows down, and there was the elderly Duchess Yalia, a charming woman in public. Less well known were her ties to the Silver Suns. The interior had been waiting to act, Qadira had not, and merely spreading the rumour Yalia was turning over evidence had sealed the woman's fate. It had been a touch impersonal, but so very satisfying. It had been the only time that chance allowed her to visit the scene of a crime in any professional capacity. She had felt quite giddy being there when they discovered the head. Just at her eye level was another frame. In her mind's eye, it opened on the charming tableau of the Silver Peak Bay, where Lady Saran's air car suffered such an unfortunate engine failure. The waters got deep so very quickly. A fitting resting place for a woman who habitually double-parked, a vile habit and indicative of a defective life. While her children had died with her, it was only sparing them from following in her footsteps. Dead, each of them, and the galaxy a better place. There was so much to do, and one lifetime was not nearly enough. They all deserved to die, and one did what one could, carefully using the opportunities life presented. Still, there was something to be said for quality over quantity. She ran a fingertip over the silver frame as it lay there, face down. It held no story, no memory to walk through. It was a lifeless thing, lacking a story of its own. But Qadira would die soon, allowing the frame to bloom into vibrant life beside the others. Then, she could lay there on the barren floor before sleep, knowing she'd given her best, and for a few days, be able to fold herself into the peaceful darkness of her room and find comfort.